Hello, 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 and welcome to the EMS Leadership Academy Safety Roundtable. It's very, very exciting. We're doing a part two. I'm here with Robbie McHugh. How you doing today, Robbie?
Great to be here. Excited to bring our guests on board. And folks, if you are watching live, feel free to comment in the chat where you're joining in from. We love to see those comments and hear where you're listening from.
And also, if the audio is okay, if there's any problems that you see, that helps us out too, because it all looks good over here, but it's really important how it is over there where you are. So please put that in the chat as well. So as I said, this is part two of a conversation that we had, gosh, about a month ago now. And we're excited to bring back our guests, Dr. David Daniels and Justin Reed. And we were, so excited about the conversation we were having. And all of a sudden we realized we have 5 minutes left and we haven't even scratched the surface of some of the stuff we wanted to talk about. So we are thrilled that we were able to get back on the schedule so quickly. And we're really going to dive into the topics of creating a just culture, a psychologically safe culture, and anything else that comes up out of our conversation today. Welcome, gentlemen.
Welcome, David. Justin,
Howdy.
good to see you.
Howdy. Thanks for having us back.
Oh, thank you for coming back. I mean, we got a great response from part one, and we didn't know at the time it was going to be a part one. So that's always fun. What I would really love to start off with is what each of you would say is what psychological safety and or just culture means to you. Is it the same thing? What does it mean when you hear, those terms? Because it gets thrown around a lot. In my experience, it's like it becomes a buzzword, and I'd love us to kind of be on the same page as we dive into that. So, David, would you mind going first?
Sure. And again, thanks a lot for having me back. Apparently, the conversation we had last time was interesting enough that we wanted to carry it on. So that's always cool when you get invited back. But if you were to ask me, and you just did, the difference between the two, I think one is a little bit more scientific, a little bit more objective, and the other is a little bit more emotional and probably around ethics. Psychological safety is a thing that there's a body of research to back it up. There's scholars that have written documents about it. It's a conversation that we're having more as we continue to evolve away or evolve out of this pandemic. I hesitate to say it's over because I don't think it is, but we're having more conversation about it, that and mental health and those kinds of topics that I talk about a lot these days. But just culture to me is really more of, it's about ethical kind of issues of the heart. Does this feel like the right way to treat people? Is this the culture that is good for the people that are here? And again, I won't suggest at all that these concepts are separate. There's a lot of similarity, but when we talk about what's just and what's right and what's ethical, it's relative. It's extremely relative to the group that we're talking about at the time. If we, again, and I say this, if you put a group of MMA fighters in the ring, just culture there and just culture at a sewing circle are going to be a little bit different, but they're perfectly just and comfortable to the people who are involved. And either things are safe or they're not. Either people get harmed or they don't. And in a just culture, there's less harm. Because we've just got that that kind of environment that everything around us is kind of centered around people feeling good and things being nice. So again, there's some similarities, but also some differences, I'd say.
And Justin, how about for you? How would you want to build on that and share your experience with those two terms?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with what Dr. Daniels was saying. And for me, it's psychological safety, and don't want it to be sort of the buzzword, because as Dr. Daniels said, there's a lot of research that's going on and has been going on around it. And I'm often guilty of like overgeneralizing. So I'll use probably sometimes a specific term and I'll use it more generically. For instance, like Just Culture. So Just Culture is like, it's the brand, it's the trademark name. And so I use that generically. It's like, hey, go grab me a Kleenex. And well, you actually meant tissue paper. But for me, Just Culture is a component of working towards psychological safety. So Just Culture makes sure that what we're holding people accountable, but we're doing it equitably. And then specifically for medicine, taking the outcome out, right? So it's very easy for the QA professional who's sitting up at the office, sort of in a vacuum, to analyze this report, knowing typically, because a lot of times these concerns will come from the hospital, knowing what the outcome is and weighing in on that in the investigation. And when I say take the outcome out of it, we realize as paramedics, like, you can do everything right and still have a negative outcome. And you can do everything wrong, and by the grace of God, you still have a positive outcome. And so take the outcome out of it and analyze the system and try and look for the system's improvements. Instead of trying to identify the individual and say, you were bad, say, why did you fail within the system? And I think in medicine, we do a terrible job of that. And Just Culture is one way to operationalize how we analyze that. And so again, under the trademark, right, there's flow charts and there's diagrams that help you get to it, but anybody can have a Just Culture system and not pay for the actual trademark and the processes. And then psychological safety for me is, I think it's paramount right now that in this era of the Great Resignation, we're trying to focus on, well, there's a shortage of paramedics, and so we need to do these recruiting efforts, and I need to be out there and spreading our branding and recruiting more. And again, getting with the system, we need to look inward and say, how can we retain better? And psychological safety is an important component of that, because if our paramedics feel safe coming to work, and less on the environmental factor, although that's important, but what I'm talking about is they don't feel like they're targeted. They don't feel like, hey, I have to be perfect every time, otherwise I'll be fired or reprimanded. All that does is just lead to an unaccountable system where the crews will hide it, right? Because they have so much autonomy. If they don't feel psychologically safe, they can't report, hey, I messed up on this call, I think we've got a system problem, because they'll be concerned that you're going to come after them. So that's kind of overall, at least where my head's at.
Yeah, that was great. I really, I think was really clear. I think the both of you did a great job with that. So let's talk about the role of a leader in those distinct but related areas. What do you want to say about leadership in that regard, David? Loaded question for the day.
It's not. It's real. If you condone it, you own it. If you condone a just culture, then you own a just culture. If you condone a culture where people, and I find it interesting when we get into conversations about accountability and all that type of thing, that often, how do you hold people accountable in a system that is broken? How do you do that? How do you hold people accountable when they've not been given clear objectives in the first place? It's simply go out and do it, and then I will critique you after you do it and give you my feedback on how I thought you should have done, but you never shared that with me in the beginning. So creating a just culture, having an environment that is psychologically safe, reducing exposure to psychosocial hazards, all start with leadership. They all start with leadership, because it is the leader. It is someone in leadership. Now, there's the role of the leader and the characteristics of a leader. Those are people, sometimes they don't have both of them. So they have the position of a leader, but not the characteristics to go along with it. And in many cases, that's not their fault, because we never showed that on that anyway. I mean, that's another system problem. But anyway, what a leader does is be really clear about where it is that we are going, what it is, what it'll look like when we get there, and what the journey's going to be like. And he or she generally starts heading that direction and tries to take as many people along with him or her while they're going. It's not running off down the road and saying, "Hey, here I am." And no, it's taking people with you. So there is no way to achieve the condition of safe, to get safety, to get psychological safety, to get a just culture. You can't do that without effective leadership. It's not doable. It's just not possible. And I was talking to someone the other day, and it's still sticking in my head, is you have to look at where you are, look in the mirror first, because wherever you are, if you don't like it, you're leading other people the same direction.
That's really good. And David, I just think back to our last conversation. I mean, you both pointed to it. You said, 95% of the problem is not the people, it's the system. And,
Yes.
I think what I've kind of been thinking about safety in the last few years, and as a leader, how do you create change? I feel like that phrase, that concept of safety, who can argue with it? Who doesn't want to have a safer organization? So that might be the one tool, or the one access, or maybe the path for an organization or a leader. If you're not sure where to start with safety. Create a committee, gather people around and talk about your commitment to safety and how you're going to communicate that to everyone else. I've seen this in organizations that, they've held town hall meetings. They've created posters on the wall with pictures and signatures and said, here's our commitment to a safer organization. And we are not going to penalize somebody for bringing up something that they find is unsafe, or that they did that had a bad outcome. And so people really they see their leaders speaking it. They've got the reinforcement on the posters when they walk in on the door that we are committed. Nobody will get fired for reporting a safety error. It's only under, gross negligence or intentional malintent. If they determine somebody did something, that they might hold somebody liable for that, but really it's taking on the systems approach to safety. And I feel like that's just one pathway that leaders can use to help create change, when, some people often say, well, where do I even begin? This is such a big problem. And I mean, Justin, I know you've shared some stories before, or you've shared in organizations how challenging that can be, especially to create change over a long period of time.
Yeah, no, I mean, because what we're talking about here is the culture shift, right? We have the culture in our industry, and we're not unique to this, right? There's other industries that are dealing with the same exact problems. But we have this culture of we kind of brag about it sometimes, that we eat our young, right? There's what happens at the firehouse stays at the firehouse, and there's, what happens in the back of the truck stays in the back of the truck. And what we're trying to do is change that culture and bring it around. And it takes time. And so our journey, specifically my journey with Just Culture, I'm 6 years in. It's one of the very first things that I brought because it was so important, was bringing this around. And we're still not 100% today. And, maybe 3 years in, I would say probably the division. So I'm responsible for the EMS division, and we were good, right? We were probably 80%, but there's still that 20% was a big 20% to overcome. And then slowly but surely, we've started to bring the other divisions along, because they realize, hey, we're operationalizing and hardwiring what we do. And it actually makes the job easier. It's so much work on the front end, but if you can get it dialed in, proceduralized, it becomes so much easier moving forward, because you start to get proactive. And it's so much easier to be proactive, but there's a lot of work up front. For some of the leaders, you'll realize this when it's man, it's going to take me too long to teach you. I'll just do it myself. It'll take me too long to teach you. I'm just going to do it myself. And then your plate is running over, and now you start dropping things. And once you do it, you realize, hey, if I spend an hour sitting down, explaining what needs to get done, get that off of my plate, somebody else can be responsible for it, and it makes us a lot more efficient. It's the same thing with bringing in a Just Culture system. It's hard. It's daunting. Know that it takes time, and find your small wins along the way. And I've shared with, some of my other friends at other agencies. They're like, how do we do it? This division or these chiefs don't want to buy into it. And I tell them, I'm like, sometimes good people are going to have to fail or be fired until you can get to where and it's okay. It shouldn't have to be that way, but that's what reality is. And typically what you'll find is you'll have a case where the naysayers will bring you in, probably because they want to save one that's in the clique. And guess what? Do exactly what you do consistently with everything else. And once it potentially saves one of their own or helps them out of a sticky situation, they'll click. They'll start to buy into it. And that's how you start getting widespread adoption, because you could force it down everybody's throat and everybody's going to bail on you.
Mhm.
It's the slow incremental change that's sustaining, not the rapid big push.
That's great advice.
There is a part of me that when I hear that kind of description also thinks, because slow change is comfortable for people, but as the pandemic showed us, quick change is possible if we want to. We just have to want to enough. The pain of remaining the same can sometimes overcome folks' resistance to change. And that's basically a risk management exercise. It's how long do we want to bleed employees until we change this? How long do we want our budget to be cut before we connect with the community that we serve? How long? I mean, just think what outcomes, and none of these are good or bad outcomes. They aren't. The question is, which one do you want? There's a concept in future studies. They talk about this thing called the cone of plausibility, where you look at the present, where we are today, and if you look out into the future, there's infinite options in the future. The question is, which one do you want? Which one do you want to work towards? We have zero control over the past and almost infinite influence over the future. Not control, but influence over our future. So what do we want next? And I, particularly for my brothers and sisters in, fire rescue service and an EMS, been around since the 1800s, and we've, done things, again, Justin, you've heard this with 200 years of progress, 200 years of tradition unimpeded by progress. Well, that's cute. The challenge is the rest of the world believes that some of these things could be changed tomorrow if we really wanted to. So if we really, really realized that it was the system and not the person, we'd focus on the system and not the people. This is I heard there's a woman by the name, she's passed long past, Mary Parker Foley. She was a social scientist and management theorist back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, but she was a woman. So people are listening to the men talking about, we've got to be able to measure everything. And she was talking about something that we're now 100 years later finally starting to realize. This is about how do we create a social system that is better for the human beings we want to bring into it. So we build a crappy system, put really good people into it, and then wonder why they don't feel good in it, because it's a crappy system. So fix the system, pay attention to the system, and focus on creating an environment where human beings want to be there and things get better. And that can happen tomorrow. We could have had people working remote 10 years ago. We didn't want to. And COVID forced, we could have been more just and more kind to people. But, since we weren't dealing with a global pandemic, we could get away with it. So, it's not right or wrong. The question is, what outcome do you want and when do you want it? Because if you want the outcome tomorrow, you're going to probably have to change today.
A question that I had, David, is I'm so on board with what you're saying, as you know, and I've been teaching systems theory and organizational change I've had my business almost 20 years, my other business, and yet even when people see system, they still want to look for the individual problem. And I think that this paradigm shift needs to happen. And I'm really curious from the two of you, like, how do you communicate that so that people really do see, no, really, it's the system, rather than having people go, yeah, we need to create a good culture, but this person over here or that person over there or this group of people, right? Like there's always that looking for the individual. And personally, I think it's because it looks easier in the short term. Like let's get rid of Joe or Susie because, you know, they're the problem. But then you replace Joe and Susie and the same thing happens.
Yeah, and I think to that point, and then going back to what Dr. Daniel said was like, what you condone, you own. And for our journey, for my journey here, it was taking the book Extreme Ownership, and actually embodying that and saying, if there's a failed airway in the field, it's my fault. Right. So what I condone, I own. And so it works the other way, is saying, well, that's my fault. And if you say that, there's a second book, which is Dichotomy of Leadership, because people took extreme ownership to the extreme. But what it does is it changes the way that you frame problems. And if I just say, well, if they missed an airway, they're bad, I'll never do anything to fix it. But if I say they missed an airway, it's my fault, now I'm going to bring a totally different lens to this problem and say, okay, how did they fail in the system that I've designed? I wasn't out there, I wasn't their hands and feet, but I design and have influence over the environment that they work in. And maybe there were environmental factors, there were system factors, there was psychological stress that came into it. And by owning that, I don't just dismiss it to say, well, that was human error. That was a bad person. It's, man, what would have happened if I would have put somebody else in the exact same situation? More than likely they would have had the same outcome. Cool. Let's figure out what the system is. And then going back to psychological safety, when we're having these discussions, when there is an investigation, the crews have to have they have to know that they're safe to be honest, because you can't get to the root cause unless you gloss over and knock out all the high level excuses that are going to come out and start to get into, like, what's going on at home? What was your frame of mind when you started the shift? And it's totally foreign, because it's like, hey, that was a cardiac arrest. You were 6 hours into the shift, but that's easy to focus on. What's hard is to open up and be able to see the bigger system at large. But that what you condone, you own, goes back to own it. Own the failure that happened, and now it's on your plate, and you don't want to fail again. So you want to put everything you can in place to be able to make sure that doesn't happen again. That then builds better systems, and right.
And I think one other visual thing one tool you might be able to give people is just this visual aid of how do you describe it. And I just kind of Googled here, Swiss cheese model. I mean, this is a common, example that gives a little bit of life to the situation of, how does, there's all sorts of different graphics of this, but it's the poor soul at the end of this arrow that really is the one that's left to blame when there's all sorts of layers of possibilities that possible systems approaches to stopping, one of these patient errors from happening, different safeguards and weaknesses. If you Google Swiss cheese model healthcare, you're going to get all sorts of different ideas of how to visually explain to people that, this isn't one individual's fault. This is a systems failure.
And I think the easiest way to apply that is when you're doing an investigation is to look at that and say, typically in our line of work, how did a single point of failure lead to this negative outcome, lead to this conversation, right? We have it all the time in the hospitals, right? There's so many layers in between the failure, but in the streets in the back of the truck, typically there's a single point of failure that could lead to a bad outcome. And for years, we will luck into the good outcomes and figure out how can I put barriers in place. Things like checklists, right? The checklist manifesto. I think Atul Gawande wrote that book. Is brilliant, and especially we've tried to implement it, and I know lots of others have had experience with this. You're like, well, I shouldn't need a checklist to be able to do my job. Well, absolutely you do. Like, why was Sully able to land that plane the way that he was bingo, it was a checklist. If you're a helicopter pilot in combat, guess what? Before you engage, you go through a checklist. So how are we as paramedic, as firefighter, as EMT saying, well, we're above a checklist? No, you're not. We're fallible. I need to give you resources, and I'm not trying to micromanage. What I'm saying is your mind is fallible, and I'm trying to build that Swiss cheese model so your single human error doesn't lead to a negative outcome.
Yeah, from checklists to training. I mean, training is a whole nother component of things that you can put into place. I think there's a quote that says, like, you will not rise to your level, to your level of expectation, that you will rise to your level of, or you'll fall to your level of training, your highest level of training, right? So if you just expect everyone to perform perfectly, you're probably going to be disappointed. But if you train with the checklist, you train those advanced airways, you train, those low frequency, high, acuity or high stress situations, then you're going to start to like raise the bar a bit of what to expect from people. And Betsy does have a comment in here, we've talked about structures drive results and behaviors, right? And it's having those policies in place, like really questioning the way it's always been done. Like, if you are going to have a commitment to just culture and psychological safety and this promise of a new future, it's re-looking at those structures that are in place that are going to produce results. It's the good news, right? If you change the structures, you start to change your results.
So I have another one of these. It's a really crazy idea, but I think it'll work. How about, instead of reworking these old systems every year, we try to figure out how we can start over every year?
Yeah.
What would that be like? What would it be? So new businesses get created in this country every single day. People take an idea, and before you know it, they're bazillionaires. So why is it in the public sphere, in the things that we do for the public, we feel like we have to do the same thing that we've been doing for the last 150 years and simply tweak it for the present? I honestly believe we should be looking at ways to start all over again as often as possible. And so particularly every generation. So there are too many organizations right now who have a new generation of people operating on the rules and policies of people who are retired, dead, long forgotten. So why do we do? Well, because somebody broke the rules 30 years ago and the rule's still on the books, but it doesn't apply to any of us. Well, but we've got to have it because. What would it be like if at the beginning of the budget cycle or what have you, we said, look, let's act as if we don't have an organization at all, and we build it from scratch. And of course, you don't have to. So there's parts that we could bring in from what we're already doing. They're already there. Okay, that'll work. We bring that. That part's not going to work. So over the next X period of time, we're going to have to reinvent that thing. Now, you're going to find, obviously, that some things still work. I mean, really, as innovative and creative as I try to be, there are some things that, so wet stuff on red stuff still puts it out. Mm-hmm. But I'm suggesting that we get too attached to the ways that we've done business forever. And none of us like it. None of us like it. But we keep doing it. And sometimes I don't know why. It's the rules. The rules are made by people. Make some new ones. The policies are set by human beings. Create some new ones because it's not working for us. And ultimately, so I live in a community right now that has 108,000 people and has no hospital. We're the size of Boston. Our ALS response time is in the half-hour range, and it's been this way forever. A lot of it is because of years and years of underinvestment, because I live in a community that's predominantly Black. That's why it's that way. And let's fix it. No, how about if we start all over again and create a system for this community that works for this group of people, and not simply, I think you could take that thought in an EMS system, any place, not everybody needs 15 medic units with 2-minute response time because the houses are an hour apart. So how's it going to work for that community to get the pre-hospital healthcare that they need? Not what they do in New York or what they do in Nebraska. It's what does this community need? And literally, look at it as starting all over every year.
Yep. David, I think to that point, I mean, you've got here what happened in Harris County, Texas, right? ESD 11, the fact that they were able to start with a blank canvas and a checkbook, and they invented the system that they wanted. They created it from nothing. Now they had informed people, they brought stakeholders together. I think it's just a prime example of how you can create from nothing, and what are the opportunities to, you kind of blow up the way it's always been done, and you have an opportunity to start anew. And sorry, Justin, you were going to chime in.
Yeah,
see you
no,
nodding
actually,
about
those are our neighbors to the east.
Yeah.
So yeah, really great system that they're building out there. And Dave, I'm going to take your curveball, and I'm going to hit a foul ball into the stands with that. I think you hit on something that's super important. I promise I'll connect it to psychological safety. But we have this huge issue of you call, we haul, right? So most expensive means of transport to most expensive means of healthcare. And that's a whole problem in and of itself. But healthcare in general, we have this huge issue with equitability, right? Our healthcare system is not equitable. And I'm not even going to get on that soapbox. But what I'm going to say is, with blowing up the model, what are we responsible for, right? So we provide life-saving intervention. Cool, got that. But we also, a lot of times, we navigate people through healthcare, right? And so what's wrong with, the crew goes out there and it was, welfare check for somebody that was on the side of the road. It was heat exhaustion. Crew goes out there, patient doesn't want to go to the hospital. And what do? Hey, we're in service, head to the next call or head back to the house. What happens in a couple minutes? That person's walking down the road and they're fine. And then they get hit by a car. Well, why couldn't we take that patient home? Right? Well, we're going to talk about liability and we don't get reimbursed. But guess what? Our responsibility is public safety, is all of this stuff. So why are we not talking about like walkability of our the areas that we're responsible for? Or how about this one? Food insecurities. It's very poor. I mean, it's unhealthy to be poor, right? And it starts this feedback loop and food insecurities, and we know that there's food deserts. Why are we not addressing these issues, right? We just keep hoping that somebody else is going to change it. And I see this, the agenda for 2050, it talks about this, but I see that we sit at the center of so many different aspects of healthcare, of public safety. Why don't we connect them all, right? And so I'm listening to this discussion.
Preach, brother.
I'm on my soapbox here, but I'm listening to this organization that's called Unite Us, and they're talking about discharge planning and ensuring that these patients have access to food and have access to primary health care for uninsured and things like that. But all they're talking about is the hospital. And I'm like, hey, homie, how about if they never even see the hospital? They're going to see us. So why can't we connect into that? And guess what? You put a little bit of effort up front that you're not going to get reimbursed for, but it'll overall lower what your response time is. And then I told you I would connect it back, builds into psychological safety. Because for me, I speak for one, I enjoy being a paramedic when I can make a difference. I love those paramedic calls. How about some of this burnout may be because we're just stuck doing what we know isn't best for the patient? Why don't we build a system where we can refer them to a food pantry, or find a way to get them to a sobering center, or find them a way to get them the resources they actually need, not the ED who's going to repeat the same cycle that they're overburdened and they're going to medically clear them and they're going to discharge them. But I think one of the big things we have to tackle, Dave, to your point, is that the equity in healthcare is horrible.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, Robbie and Lisa, we're on a roll here, but
it's all right. You have at it.
So you, Justin, you just made me think about a dear friend who since passed away, Chief Alan Brunacini, and some of the things that and others, many of us learned so much from him back in the day. Again, he was so far ahead of most of not only the fire rescue service and EMS and public sector in general. He just really way out there, and people thought he was nuts. But they were talking about, I don't know if they even still have it, but they used to have a program where they would put money in the fire truck that they would raise through donations. And if they found someone who needed, some gas or something like that, they could give them the money to make a difference right then and there, because their belief was that's a call we're going to have down the road anyway. So why don't we just eliminate it again right now, just deal with it. And the ability to, most people who come into the pre-hospital healthcare system, that's what it is, the pre-hospital healthcare system, they do it because part of the reason why they do it is that they love people and they want to make a difference. But what they can't do, and you talked about it so eloquently, what they can't do is take over and over. You send me to the stabbing, to the shooting. Those folks were going to die anyway. but you give me more and more and more and more and more of that because that makes the headlines. That's what gets on television. But what you don't give me is opportunities to actually make a difference. If I could have just taken that person home, they wouldn't have got hit on the road later. If I could have pointed them to a treatment center, if I could have, sent social services over to that older person's home and had somebody work with them in the home, then, perhaps we wouldn't have to come back for the code, 2 days later. And again, these folks in EMS, these are some of the most creative people on the planet if you simply remove the barriers to their creativity and the goofy rules and restrictions, many of which have been put in place by a bunch of people who are no longer here, and allow people to be creative to solve the problem, or at least contribute to the solution to the problem. It'd just be a much better place to be. And folks, I come back, wow, we did some really cool things last week. And yeah, I've got to deal with a shooting or a stabbing or what have you. That's part of the gig, but it's not all of the gig.
I think this is such a great conversation when we talk about the opportunities of telemedicine, treat in place, alternative destinations that are a pilot with the ET3 model that right now only about 200 organizations across the country have access to. But what are we learning? Like, the pandemic accelerated so much of this. And at the same time, David, I loved what you're saying, like, stop stifling the creativity. The biggest enemy to learning is knowing already, I think is the phrase. So how can we create a learning organization? How can we share, what's worked for you? Paramedics are such autonomous beings. You put them in any situation and, they will figure it out. They will find a creative opportunity in sometimes policies and procedures, in the fear of what's going to happen if I go outside the box with this thinking. What are people going to think? Am I going to get reprimanded because, this wasn't exactly the way the policy says that it should be done? And, lately I've had a lot of conversations with crews and with other brilliant people about, how do you help people that have been doing this for so long in the same way? How do you help them, give them the tools or change that thought process to say, okay, now we have a whole nother set of tools at our disposal. We can bring in a telemedicine provider. We can navigate you. We can be that healthcare navigator to connect you with other services and other systems. Because if we don't do something now, it's just going to be this endless cycle, this repetitive cycle, which creates more burnout, which creates more recruitment and retention issues. So Lisa and I usually say, like, how can we go upstream, right? You can't rescue every person that might be drowning in the water if they're coming down the stream quick, but can you go upstream to stop people from jumping in the river, which is going to stop the drowning? So how can we make people feel safer? How can we let them kind of think on their own? We are committed and care about getting those units to the scene of an emergency. After that, we are leaving so much up to them and how to be autonomous and how to creatively solve and address those situations. And I think it's a lot about our approach, and I'm still learning this. How do we explain the idea of bringing a telemedicine provider in? It creates a lot of fear for the patients. And recently I was on a great conference call with these people talking about this challenging, sticky, this wicked problem that is almost a little bit unsolvable. And somebody said, why don't we treat it as implied consent? Not, do you want to do a telemedicine treatment? Or a telemedicine interview? That sounds very intimidating, but we don't ask somebody to put an oxygen mask on if they're having trouble breathing. What if we just made it implied consent? And until they said, no, stop, I don't want this telemedicine thing, you go down that pathway. You let them think of, here are the tools at your disposal. Now, it's considered implied consent, and you creatively help that person. Obviously, if it's a life or death situation, we treat them like any other call, but maybe that's one way to this implied consent conversation to tackle the problem.
Yeah, no, I think like a tangible way for this is much like if anybody sat in any of the national meetings on the agenda for the future, they had this amazing model for driving innovation, which was the World Cafe model. So one of the tangible takeaways is, why don't you make I'm speaking to myself here because I haven't done this, but is why don't you get an innovation committee together, right? And so charge them with some ideas and then bring everybody together and say, okay, we're going to do the World Cafe model. Google it. It's super simple. Essentially, the idea is you have a series of questions that need to be asked, put everybody at tables. You have a moderator at each table. And in this, say, hey, what's one way that we can innovate? And let's just say there's zero fiscal note to it. So no budget, right? What's something that we can do with what we have, go. And so essentially everybody talks about it at one table. And then you say, okay, we're going to go for 10 minutes. Now break. Now everybody has to go to a different table and then address the same topic. So now you're getting the diverse opinions and, okay, I heard this at the previous table. I've expanded on it here, and come up with 3 tangibles that you can do and set it and say, hey, no budget, right? So what we have right now, and see what sort of innovation you can drive. What you'll probably find out is some of your paramedics are actually doing this now, and they just had a platform to talk about it. And the other way to drive the sustainability is when somebody does an outside the box thinking, celebrate it. Make sure that everybody knows this is what we want. We had, for example, a guy who was going to the grocery store to get his wife some cupcakes and flowers and things like that for her birthday. We're in Texas, everybody carries. And as he's getting out of his vehicle, drops his pistol, shoots himself. So he's stable. You know, they call the wife, let her know what's going on transport, and the crew calls the supervisor, says, hey, we're on our way back to the hospital. Can we go out of service for a little bit? Well, what do you mean? Well, we're actually going to go back to the store and we're going to get them all the stuff that her husband was going to, and we're going to take it to her. Like, absolutely. And so then we celebrate it and we share it with everybody to inspire and encourage everybody. This is the behavior, the making a positive impact. This is the behavior that we want to be repeated.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I've used that World Cafe in a number of organizations model, and it's just amazing how at first people are like, I don't want to, and then they get started, and it's like, because they're in the yes and mode, right? I don't know if you're not familiar with that, but it's like there's no but why we can't do that. And the thing that I think is important to know before you go into any of those conversations is thinking about every design problem has constraints. When we talk to organizations about recruitment and retention, they want to, like you said, budget issues or people are that way and this is why it's not. And we say, listen, every design problem has constraints. And if you know what the constraints are, you can get creative. And then sometimes you have to look at those constraints and ask, is it true? Right? Is it true that those constraints exist? Right? So I'm a huge baseball fan. And, we have in baseball, there's, if you're not familiar with baseball, it's, 3 outs, then the next team takes over. Right. And, 3 strikes, you're out, and there's certain rules. You can't complain at the end of the game and say, oh, we lost because we only got 3 outs per inning. No, it's part of the game, man. Right. So, again, I'm not saying that you don't get curious about the constraints and see what you can reinvent, but constraints aren't a reason to not invent, is my point. And I think that unfortunately has been a lot of the culture in organizations is, we don't have the money. So, rather than, hey, we don't have the money, what are we going to create? Right. And let's get our best resource together to have conversations, whether it's World Cafe style or some other way, to get people involved in the creative solutions and then experiment. That's the other thing that's missing. Robbie mentioned the learning organization. So much of the time people will try something, and if it doesn't go beautifully, they're like, oh, we tried. No, it was one iteration. Try again, right? Like the old, if at first you don't succeed, right? Try again.
Right.
Progress over perfection.
Yeah, Lisa, you just, I was triggered a little bit when you were talking about money. So my mom was 14 years old when I was born. We were on public assistance when I graduated high school. I was the first person to own a home, first person to go to college, all the stuff. And so when people talk about they don't have money, what I hear is it's not important to you. Yeah. Money is only an issue in the absence of value. And particularly in the public sector, we do it all wrong. We go, how much money do we have, and then figure out what we can do. When it should be just the opposite. What is it that is most important to us? And now let's assemble the resources to get that done. Obviously, everything can't be important at the same time. We can't do everything. But what is it that we're trying to get done There's always resources to get done what's important to us. We'll we'll put a box on the street. We'll put 2 paramedics on there. We'll half train them, saying we don't have time to train them. And then we'll take 3 times the amount of time necessary to train them to do an investigation when they do something wrong. Because that was more important. Well, you got to hold people accountable. And when frankly, had you put them in the class that they could have sat in for 2 hours, you would have, that's 20 hours worth of investigation time you wouldn't have had to take. Money and all resources are only an issue in the absence of value. What is important? Do that. Build the organization around what is important, not only to me, but to the people I'm in this endeavor with, to include this community. There's a lot of perceptions again around. So what do we want our healthcare system to be? Why don't you ask people? Why don't you ask people instead of using the same model again that we've had in place for X number of decades that was set up by a whole different set of people, most of which who are dead now? What do we need this healthcare system to be? And what is the role for the pre-hospital providers? Well, they're not doctors. Yeah, but we see the patients before you do. Let's have a conversation about what we want and what is valuable to us, and then build a system to provide for that need. It's really not that hard. It's more difficult to keep doing the same stuff. We spend all this energy to keep doing the same stuff. It is unsafe. It is expensive. It is calamitous, but we'll keep doing it. Why? Because it is a lot easier to remember than it is to imagine. Imagining is hard, but yeah, put the time into imagine. What could this be if we simply focused on what was important to us? Us, whoever's in this what's important to us, not all these other people. And again, as much as I enjoy picking up ideas from other people, those other ideas have to match where I'm going. Not, I'm just copying because let's call Justin's department. It may not work for you. Where are you going? And then pick a, hey, we're going this direction. We see you're going a similar direction. How can you help us avoid some of the pitfalls? What is valuable? Are these people valuable to you? Mm-hmm. Is them feeling safe? Is that important to you? Well, then there's not. Let's not worry about all the other obstacles and the money and the policies and all that kind of nonsense. These people are important. It is important for me to care for other human beings. Whatever it takes to do that is legal, moral, and ethical. That's what I'm going to do.
And I think it's our job as leaders to educate those elected officials so they understand who we are, what we do. They get elected to positions and they get thrown right in. They usually don't get the briefings. They don't have the understandings of what we do. Ray Bereshansky is one of the speakers at the upcoming EMS Leadership Summit. And he talks about, he was in a deputy director of public health position in a state organization. And when they're talking about vaccine administration, and he mentioned the word ALS versus BLS or paramedic versus basic, his boss, the one in charge of public health for the whole state, didn't know what a paramedic could do versus an EMT could do. So I think that's on us as well. If they say there's no money, I call BS, right? It's just, you're right. It's not important enough to them until we explain the value of what we do and how we can help. Spot on.
And how many times have we heard that, Robbie, doing over the last 10 years, the EMS leadership training? We don't have the money. We don't have the budget. Well, you think we're color us surprised that you have a retention problem?
And how much does a new employee cost?
Right.
Yeah.
It costs $10,000. National studies show in EMS, the EMS industry specifically, direct cost to lose one person is $10,000. Not to mention the indirect cost and the impact on the leaders of constantly training these new cohorts of people to come in, to constantly bring them up to a certain beginning level. And then it's no wonder why you can never advance to that next level of, excellence when it comes to, you're just getting everybody to the bare minimum.
And Robbie, I'll tell you, it is easier to lose them or kill them because seriously, because if you keep people and you injure them, particularly in the public sector, it's going to cost 3 to 4 times their salary to get their work done. So losing them actually is cheaper for that's why that's the feedback loop. It's actually easier but it's very, very expensive when you could simply do it right the first time.
Yeah.
And I think it was said in the last, in part 1, we talked about the curiosity versus judgmental, being judgmental. And And also, Robbie, you mentioned about, knowing is the enemy of creativity, right?
Mhm.
And I think that it really does, you know, not to oversimplify, but sometimes these things are just simple. Like, get curious, ask questions.
Mhm.
Where do you feel unsafe? What do you need from us? I don't know if I can do it, but tell me what you need. These are simple ways that are just communicate so much to the people you lead. Like, holy cow, not only are they interested in, but they listened and, are committed to changing things. Like, that
Yeah.
doesn't cost a dime.
Yeah. And the reality is we literally have the world at our fingertips. You just have to break the model of stop doing the things the way that we've always done it and figure out, right? Just Google, right? Google. There's once you start doing it, you'll start to find the resources. So IHI, the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, they have these white papers on improving joy in work. And so you don't have to reinvent the wheel for yourself. A lot of the stuff is geared towards hospitals. So you have to, have enough snap to you to be able to kind of see how it applies. Or going back to the idea of, you don't rise to the occasion, you sink to the level of your training. Read Colonel Grossman's book on combat. Politics aside and how people feel about Colonel Grossman, but read it. And what he talks about is a paramedic's everyday life is stress. The stress is different, right? It's not combat, but he talks about a lot of principles in there that you can apply to it. So get out of our box, put a new lens on the problem, and figure out what other people are doing and figure out how to apply it to what your situation is right now. And, ask questions, get out there and ask questions on what other people are doing. And if you're an introvert, Google is your friend. There's so many resources that are out there. A lot of stuff is free. But get out there and start learning on ways to innovate. Betsy mentioned it in the chat, is social determinants of health is where I think EMS is going. And we have to make sure that we're on the forefront of that, because I don't think community paramedicine needs to be this, I've got a paramedic trained as a mid-level, which I do think is possible, but going out with an ISTAT and doing lab corrections and things like that. I think it's putting somebody in a fly car in a single resource vehicle and go out there and visit with them and figure out what they actually need, right? And how can I connect you with this resource and be that model that connects it. You don't have to go out there and do all this fancy stuff. That's really good for branding, but it's short-lived, right? And we're seeing that a lot right now with community paramedic programs that were hospital diversion programs, and they controlled the finances of it, right? Let somebody else do that. Right. Let's make the most meaningful impact and try to figure out in your innovation, just like hopefully you manage your financial and your retirement portfolio, think in short and long-term investments, right? What can I do that's a short-term hit for my short-term investment, but what's most important for long-term investment? That's where I think social determinants of health is going to come from.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and sorry, Justin, you mentioned Googling, there's all sorts of resources out there. I just want to put a little promo in for you. Both are being featured at the EMS Leadership Summit starting September 20th. So emsleadershipsummit.com. We've got over 40 speakers talking about, how do we innovate, advocate, and inspire for change in the future. So folks, you can get your free pass at emsleadershipsummit.com. Just wanted to put that out there since it is kind of around the corner. So sorry, David, I know you're.
Yeah, no, I'm just sitting here thinking what it would have been like for me in my years in active fire rescue service if there were more people like Justin to talk to. It's absolutely encouraging to watch new generations of people come into this age-old activity with clear thought and not so bogged down by the way things have been, because there's the possibilities. They're there. And now that we have access to the Google machine and basically we can find virtually anything that we need at our finger. All we have to do is look it up on our phone. But that also that takes a shift. And Lisa, you mentioned it earlier, a shift on the part of leaders who think that they have to know it all. So if you're a leader, you have an EMS organization, You don't have to know it all. You don't. The thing that you have to do, I think the thing that you should do, you don't have to because a lot of people aren't doing it. The thing that you should do is focus on creating a safe environment for the people that are around you. That's it. Just do that part. If you create a safe environment so people like Justin can come up with ideas and not feel like, oh, I'm going to get fired. It's creating that thing where, we bring people like, Robbie and Lisa around that folks aren't going to run away with their hair on fire. If you create that kind of environment, a lot of the old problems will simply vanish because they're old problems. But old problems don't get solved with the same old thoughts. Just create a safe environment for people, and emotionally safe, psychologically safe, physically safe, of course, because if they break their leg, they can't work for you. But if that's your focus as a leader, then my goal is really to create a safe environment for people. You do that, all the other stuff is just so much easier, and we can have more Justins come up and then, and people see, well, he's doing good stuff and innovative and creative stuff, and he still got a job. I think I'll try too.
Yeah, on that point, I promise you, you can ask anybody who works here. I mess up way more than I succeed, but I'm not scared. I'm not scared to fail. But that's the important thing is don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to get out here and get on things like this where you're out there communicating your ideas, because you never know who needed to hear that in the moment. And then most importantly is my one piece of advice for everybody that's honest: please commit to this industry. Don't use this as a stepping stone, because that's why we can't continue this momentum, is because we lose our best and our brightest. Figure out your finances. We didn't get into this for the money. Figure them out. You can live with less. And for the sake of the industry, for the profession, and for most importantly, for the patients that we care for every day, commit to the industry. And if you're committed and nothing else is an option except for here, you're going to do everything you can to make this the best profession that there is.
Wow, beautifully said. Dr. David Daniels, Justin Reed, thanks again for joining us. I wanted to, again, throughout this book, The Fearless Organization by Amy Edmondson, kind of one of the founders of the idea of psychological safety in the workplace. A lot of really healthcare relevant topics in this book. A great read. So check it out, The Fearless Organization. I've got a few copies, and it's always great to just browse through it and thinking about this great topic. So,
yeah. And I just want to say, it's just been a joy to have you both on again. And I just learned so much from both of you, every time I talk to you. And I want to thank you for being here. And I do want to thank you again for being part of the summit that's coming up, and just your commitment to this industry and this profession and just making it the best it can be. It's just really moving. And I appreciate that about both of you. And you too, Robbie.
Let me add while we're congratulating. I just really appreciate the stick-to-itiveness of both of you to take this idea. Because like I said, 4 years ago when the summit started, some people thought you all were nuts. I'm sure they did. They thought, that's never going to go anywhere.
Yes.
They thought you guys
were not shy.
but look, here we are. Look what's going on, and there's more to come. And so again, congratulations to both of you for sticking to this and helping the emergency medical services or pre-hospital healthcare industry see that there's more out there. You don't have to limit yourself to some of the nonsense that you've heard from other people. There's more. It's not a zero-sum game. Innovation is not a zero-sum game. And it's just great to be a part of the family, So we're looking forward to even greater things coming in the future.
And so far, we've had over 12,000 people participate in the 3 years prior, and from 44 different countries. Wow. So we started in 2019, and people were not shy to tell us we were crazy, and we were like, all right, well, we'll see how it goes. And here we are 4 years later with a lot of people coming to us and saying, hey, can we speak at your summit? We're like, sure.
And how great is it to meet people like Justin and David, to really find the innovators out there that are doing that are committed to change, that are really inspiring for the future. And again, we always appreciate your time and chatting about these great topics, especially safety.
Absolutely. Thanks for giving us the platform for this. Appreciate all that you do.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
All right, folks. Again, check it out, emsleadershipsummit.com. We've got great sessions in store from Justin and from David Daniels, and 40 other speakers from around the world, bringing their diverse perspectives and insights into how to inspire, how to advocate, and how to innovate for the future.
Thank you, everyone.